So what I want to do today is really just discuss the business architecture of this discipline, and specifically some aspects of how it's used for the design of business. Um, we find that there is a little bit of confusion in the marketplace around the role. So what we want to do is touch on that confusion and some of the roles and disciplines that sit within that space. I also want to just spend a lot of time discussing tips and recommendations for you on how to make business architecture more successful within your business. So, some of you might have actually done it and used some of the tools and techniques out there. Having spun through the wheel quite a number of times, really just going to sort of laser focus us on, okay, well, what things can we actually do to get it adopted better within the organization? Let's get straight into it. So I'm going to move quite fast, and I have a section at the end if there's time which I'll delve into. I will make the presentation available on SlideShare and you'll be able to process that in your own time. So anyway, there's the Twitter and contact details should you want to get in touch. And really just a quick introduction into the Enterprise Architects organization. So we are a multinational niche player within enterprise architecture. And that deals across most of the domains of the architecture discipline. So we're headquartered out of Melbourne, but we have offices in Sydney, in London. We have an extended office in Africa, based out of Johannesburg, recently opened up in New York, and also kicking off another operation in Singapore. Right, so let's get into it. Now, some of you may or may not have seen my previous presentations, but I've kind of been speaking a lot about this concept of disruption. So no, it's not new, but it is placing some interesting pressures on the discipline of architecture. So obviously those pressures are being put onto the business in general, but what does it mean for architecture? And really, we spend a lot of time thinking about the digital disruption aspects. And really this talks about, from Larry Downs' book, I like this quote here, which is around technology changing exponentially. But in actual fact, a lot of the support mechanisms, let's call it that, around social, economic, and legal systems aren't actually keeping up with that degree of change. And I believe that our architectural discipline as well is struggling to keep up with some of those changes. And we're definitely needing to change how we approach. Can we do architecture the way we used to? I don't believe we can. I think there's some acceleration required in our thinking. And that's really some of the aspects that I'd like to touch on this morning. All right, so for those of you that ever worked with causal loops, all of this is trying to communicate is the fact that the feedback delay that we used to receive from the market is actually reducing. So, I was at a talk the other day about the marketing discipline, and that the science, marketing is becoming less about intuition and more about science, because you've got all these big data and big data analytics. So we're now able to get that feedback back from the market to the point where that age-old marketing saying, 50% of my budget, marketing budget works, I just don't know which 50% it is. We're actually getting to the point where we're starting to know what that 50% is. We're starting to get that information being fed back into the system. So the delay in receiving that sort of feedback loop is being reduced, and digital disruption is tending to cause that delay. Now, some of you might have read Roger Martin's really interesting book on the design of business, and he refers to this concept called the knowledge funnel. And I'm going to touch on this quite often over the next hour or so. But really what this seeks to do is explain the difference of this intuitive thinking world into this robust, repeatable, analytical thinking part of the world. You might have heard of it sometimes referred to as left brain, right brain, if you follow those sort of things. But really it talks about the shift of this mysterious, unknown, wicked problem space on the right, which is really an exploration territory, and then trying to take the discoveries that you face along that journey and industrialize them. So you're moving them through this knowledge funnel. You're finding heuristics for those unresolved mysteries, which are rules of thumb. And eventually you're getting them into sort of the codification language, which is really where most of the architecture discipline has traditionally sat sort of in the left side, codifying your business logic using a variety of tool sets. We've got many standards available in the market that one can leverage in order to try and bring some formalization to understanding business. And Judith has introduced a few of them around BizBoc, DABOC, there's TOGAF, and there's LEAD, there's DODAF, FIAF. There's all these different types of frameworks that can be used to help within that space. But there's a challenge emerging around, because of those pressures coming from digital disruption, and it's a challenge emerging around, well, how do we use these tools and how do we move organizations through this knowledge funnel more effectively? And really that's sort of just another angle of the knowledge funnel, which is taking us from this unresolved business challenges. And really the way we see business is really, that's what it's about. It's about building advantages, it's about prolonging advantages, and it's about reducing advantages. Well, no rocket science there. That's pretty much been the ethos of business for decades or centuries, I should say. But what's interesting is that there's this utility layer of business, and more of that utility layer is being put, or let's rather say more and more business is being put into that utility layer, and which is making the space of this, the discipline of this innovate, assemble, and mix of the business components becoming more and more important. That's where we see this heuristic, these rules of view of rock paths, so to speak, and these rules as you encounter certain problems within the business spaces. And ultimately, the person with the better heuristic wins. And ideally in organizations, and especially if you've dealt with knowledge management disciplines, to try and take those heuristics and codify them in some way, put them into a process model or develop a methodology, or those heuristics from the minds of individuals that are, leveraging that heuristic to earn more money, so to speak. Now, as you kind of move through that cycle, there's certain techniques that you're going to need to apply as you bridge the gap from this mystery space into the heuristic. And that tends to be sort of the lean startup world. And having been there a few times myself, there's actually quite a few pieces of the analytical aspects of business architecture that you can apply to the lean startup space. One doesn't, it's not a world of just innovation and fast-moving aspects, and there's no room for business architecture, and no room for formalized language. In actual fact, if any of you have read the Lean Startup, you'll see this it's quite an interesting view in the fact that entrepreneurship is a process, and what makes an entrepreneurial startup company successful is if they follow the entrepreneurial process. And there's a number of business architecture artifacts and tools that you can use in that space to try and understand that mystery, to try and identify your heuristics to eventually land up at different types of business models that you might want to execute against. But once you have those heuristics in place, you then want to be able to take those down and exploit them further and industrialize them and push them into the utility space. And that's where traditionally the architecture disciplines come from. Now, the business architecture journey, and this is probably some people might agree or disagree with this mandate, and we'll discuss this mandate later, but really is to accelerate your organization through that knowledge funnel. So I need to be able to get you through that funnel as quick as possible, but I still need to be able to do it in a way that's organized and to try and bring order to that chaos. So does it require an element of formalization? Which leads me to the sort of pressure cooker space. And this is a traditional model that we use for what we call tactical decisions, in which we overlay capabilities or processes onto complexity and dynamics and to strategic importance and value. But there's different things that you can do with each of these quadrants. So sort of top right is the innovation chaos space, and that's where you can expect to find mergers and acquisitions processes and those types of things. What you want to do is you want to harvest the learnings from that space. And that's really where a lot of the unsolved mysteries would probably occur. That's where the intuition aspects of the business, not to say that intuition and innovation and entrepreneurship doesn't occur across that spectrum. If we're talking about redesigning of businesses to adapt to business disruption, that's kind of like where we're talking about, right? And You've got your sort of core differentiating competencies, and really what you'd start to do is you take those mysteries and you try and make them repeatable. And sort of bottom right quadrant is where you might use some of the process engineering techniques, you might use some of the traditional business architecture landscape, you might use Six Sigma and Lean and those types of tool sets to harvest that, or understand that mystery and accelerate it a little further into more formalization space, and ultimately getting into sort of bottom left, which is your automation space, ERP, CRM type systems, and then sort of top left, which is where you start to outsource. Now, that's the journey that we follow, and that's where we see business architect being able to support that journey. But what we also see is that that space is actually getting smaller. So more and more, the thinking that differentiated you and I in the marketplace actually is becoming utility or commodity. No longer do we have to go to Silicon Valley, for example, to get top skills in certain disciplines. Software development, for example, one of them. We can get it from India at $400 a month in some sort of scenario. So a lot of the traditional thinking landscape is becoming more and more commoditized, and I believe that's occurring within the architecture discipline as well, and especially with aspects of cloud and those types of things that are coming up from the bottom of the business model and starting to industrialize a lot of the thinking into an automation layer. And what it's doing is it's resulting in this sort of innovation space, that sort of top right area, becoming quite cramped. Or cramped's probably not the right word. It's probably also moving to the right. It's moving quite fast now. This is why we keep hearing of these concepts, business model innovation, and using things like the business model canvas to help me deal with the disruptions that are occurring and helping me reboot and redesign business models, creating disruptive business models. That's the language that we're starting to deal with and interact with a lot. And it's kind of sitting in the top right space because businesses are having to try and find ways to differentiate themselves and be more competitive when a lot of the stuff that they used to have is now becoming commonplace and utility. And what we find is that it's starting to put pressure on the business model. Now, this is just how we define a business model. We might define it slightly differently, but we have a market model, a products and services model, an operating model. And what we're seeing is that there's pressure coming on this business model from sort of both ends. One is there's actually pressure from the top where we're having the likes of chief marketing officers, chief digital officers, and those types of disciplines. We're actually wanting to be equipped with the tools and techniques for architecting a business or in enterprise design or designing a business. And we're also having pressure coming from the bottom, which I've mentioned, the advent of technologies like cloud and all the rest of it, starting to push some of the traditional architectural roles sort of out into the cloud, also meaning that the individuals that used to operate in that space are having to try and look for ways to differentiate themselves. So therefore going to start moving up that stack, so to speak. And this led me to asking a variety of questions like, is there actually a future for the role of a business architect? Because ultimately the discipline of business architecture, yes, there is a future for that. And I believe that business people need to understand how to use that discipline to design their businesses properly. It's still a business architecture discipline. But the actual role of business architecture, or how long will that actually hang around for? That's given me some interesting sort of questions I've asked in the market specifically around that. Now, I'll deal with some market research later on in the presentation. But that's sort of the pressure that's occurring. And really what that's, often the result of that is this imperfect planning cycle. I'm going to deal with all the different disciplines that relate to the planning space as well. So, there is some things that I introduced in my blurb for this webinar. So 46% of business failures stem from misguided strategies. More than half of business or projects fail. 1/3 of firms fail to achieve expected results. So this is the litany of results that we tend to get from this space. And we have to start considering different ways to do things. And if we're over-formalizing this discipline, is that the right thing to actually do by introducing more frameworks and introducing more disciplines and more methods, all those types of techniques? So it's probably an interesting poll which I could run with you guys sometime in the future just to get your view on it. But really, it's which discipline is responsible for trying to fix this? And if we look at the sort of a situation analysis across the business planning execution life cycle, you've got your traditional strategic planning, marketing planning, operational delivery and execution operations. And depending upon where you are, you might have different situations that you're going to have to interact with. Okay, so this, I don't know if we should change, so I need some insight into whether we need to change. Well, I know we need to change, but can somebody please help me with how we actually do that? Down to, okay, I know why we need to change. I know how, but I don't have the resources to help me do that exercise. And then sort of right down into the space. Well, we've done all the change we need to. We've rolled out big transformation projects, but in actual fact, people are falling back into their old habits. They're actually not changing. How do we get them to change their day-to-day behavior? These are some of the sort of situations that you can expect to encounter across your business. And this is a sort of a view that I've taken around, well, where could some of these disciplines actually sit? And the slide, I imagine, result in some emotional feedback. Great, it's a discussion point. I'm happy to take some comment on that, even in the comment thread of SlideShare. But it's kind of like, well, some of these are more the traditional landscape of where we see some of the disciplines, but what you've got is sort of the business analysis space, which is very much in the delivery and execution environment, occasionally depending upon your seniority, moving up into some of the operational planning, marketing planning space. Solutions development and solution architecture kind of sitting in the same place, which is all about, with the rubber hitting the road and actually delivering on those aspects. You then have sort of the enterprise architecture, sort of looking at across operationalizing the strategy, creating the connection between strategy and the market aspects and realizing, gluing all of the other disciplines together across some of the planning and operation governance. Then you then have this thing, service design. I call it that because it's designed for really improving the experience that exists between your customer and your organization. In other words, the experience they're having with your organization. There is a gap. How do I fulfill that gap? And there's a few presentations I've done on how to leverage a couple of those techniques within the business architecture space to specifically address with the customer experience and customer journeys. But also there's the business architecture space, which we see is going up from the operational planning space right up into the strategic planning space. And that's some of the aspects I'm going to show you how to do that, and what some of the tips and tricks are within that particular space. And that sort of led to a bit of discipline overlaps. So, as the traditional Zach on top framework extended a little across a variety of domains across the top there, as well as some of the models that you might want to leverage across that framework. But you can kind of see in the middle there that there is a little bit of role confusion specifically within those spaces, and there's overlap in that space. We're seeing individuals, and I haven't even put subject matter experts in there yet, business people that might feel that they are responsible for some of those spaces. But we just look at our architecture space and we overlay maybe some of the roles from the BABOK into this environment, you'll see that there is a little bit of noise in the middle there. And if I now overlay some of the traditional roles like an enterprise architecture and solution architecture, you'll see there's once again an overlap. And not a bad thing. That's a good place for handoff to occur. It just means we have to be very clear on what each of these disciplines provide. And sort of when we do the business architecture training, we try and give the business architect an understanding of what's upstream and what's downstream. And when you architect for business, you've actually got to have that understanding. You've got to really understand what to expect from the strategic planning discipline, what it must look like, and then what buckets to put it in your own discipline. And then design the business so that the next level down can actually take it forward. So the solution architects can do something with it. But often there tends to be a gap in that space, and we have solution architects almost reinventing the wheel because stuff that's been given to them doesn't quite give them the level of detail required to now begin to codify it, so to speak. And really what this is leading to is probably more of a focus for any of you that have ever tried to launch a center of excellence, a business architecture or an architectural discipline within your organization. The problem isn't actually designing the operating model for that particular discipline. The problem is in the relationships. And really understanding the relationships that exist within the discipline, where the handle actually exists, and some of the service level agreements that would exist, and the various service offerings that each of the disciplines provide to one another. That's definitely an area that one should focus on more than necessarily looking internally at your own operations. And we've also found that within organizations there's what we call a mandate and a scope confusion. Well, who across the business model, who's responsible for which aspects? So this is an example from a tier 1 bank in which we were trying to help them position the business architecture discipline more effectively. And really what they had was ownership up at what was called the strategic architecture mandate area, and really run by business and the product manufacturing areas. And then they had ownership down below, which was all about the CIO's mandate, which was the technology discipline. But really they lacked an ownership which sat in the middle around, you know, some of the traditional stuff of business and business architecture. And then even more so, they had a huge gap in this discipline, which we've called enterprise design, which is really running across the entire enterprise. And what enterprise design is to do is take architecture, the architectural discipline, and merge it with design thinking to improve the experience of the customer with the internal capabilities of the organization. And bringing more of the design thinking clear around the experience of internal and external customers with all the services that this capabilities. And really what's missing, we find, is the glue, the pieces that glue these pieces together across entire organizations. We refer to them as functional capabilities, cross-functional capabilities, and that's core differentiating and competing capabilities. You might refer to them as competencies. It's actually interesting. I was at a conference last month. The North American view of capabilities and competencies seems to be slightly different from other places, or maybe we're different from North America. So there's just some terms there which don't get confused with. But you might have heard of core differentiating and core competing competencies. And really that's what's being referred to there on the sort of top right. But there's this mandate confusion, which we're seeing. And this is reflected in this mandate curve that we have here. And these are all about the different types of problems that one would solve as you sort of move up this curve. And obviously, as you move up the curve, you're getting to the world of higher value, but you're also getting to improving market performance, improving product and service performance, and those types of things. And that's where the enterprise discipline starts to sort of the enterprise design, merging architectural thinking with some of the design thinking aspects about helping them improve even the product design, the service design aspects of the organization. But the business architecture discipline is set traditionally in point C there. And it's often been driven bottom up. In other words, it's often been driven by an IT function. It's often been driven by a CIO who is looking to try and communicate better with the business. So business architecture is bolted on to the architectural IT landscape to try and develop models that would allow them to communicate and facilitate communication better with lines of business. So it gets pushed up from below. But we've had, they're starting to get a lot of traction from business actually coming down, realizing the need for business architecture. We've actually had organizations where we've interacted with both, gone in, we've spoken to both sides of the business and the lines of business and the CIO's section. They're both wanting to implement business architecture, but now that are these two divisions, we're aware that the other was actually trying to do the same thing. So there is a need for this meeting of minds in the middle. But really the actual discipline of business architecture, the tools and techniques that you and I use on a day-to-day basis, they're actually you can use right across that mandate curve. And they're just varying levels of complexity, one would say. So the tools I would use at the bottom would be some of the traditional requirements management aspects versus moving up the top some of the more enterprise planning, scenario analysis type tools, but still bringing a business architecture mindset to it. And really that business architecture promises, if one looks at this research from the Executive Council, it's still a bit of a journey to go, surprisingly actually, because I for one feel it's been around for a while. We should be getting the traction, but just a general view in the market is people are still grappling with what is this business architecture. Oh, introducing a new concept now, great. What's enterprise design? Well, don't worry, it's just business architecture, and we're going to design it better for you so that you can interact with it and enjoy the experience more, so to speak. But there is this sort of still this perception. Well, we've begun to make headway, but it's really it's too early to see the benefits of it. Okay. So there's still less runs on the board, so to speak, around the business architecture discipline. And that, I think, partly has been caused by the mandate. So, here are some of the top management challenges, and you can see that, all about the customer and improving flexibility and speed to get to that customer. And then there's some of the traditional reducing costs. I think this research probably, let's get the updated version. I think the increasing innovation bit is actually taking precedent now. It's actually probably becoming more of a challenge for the CEO side of necessarily reducing costs. But really, most of the business architecture work is really sitting within the reducing cost space. It's all about optimization. It's all about efficiency. It's all about squeezing the maximum out of your assets. Whereas increasing flexibility and speed is really almost up in the heuristic space. It's in that mystery space. Well, how can we help the business move through that knowledge funnel more effectively and more efficiently, so we can take these wicked problems, we can solve these wicked problems, we can take these new business ideas and get them to market quicker. And that's some of the aspects that, that's where I think the value of business architecture lies. It doesn't lie within, what does lie in some of the traditional aspects, but we truly get to that high value aspect when we start tackling some of those issues through the knowledge funnel. And here you can see sort of some of the problems that one would expect to find across the landscape. So if I'm moving up a curve, well, there's this business improvement space going up into a transition and up into this enterprise planning and performance space in the design space. So you can see, we've got some of the traditional, can you help me optimize an HR management system or improve processes, up to my business is losing 20 million in a quarter, I want to fix it, kind of going right up to the top, optimizing my product portfolio or my offerings, profitability, and then right up to we need the cost income rate, and acquire certain companies, what will it look like? How will we be able to merge the capabilities into this organization? So that's sort of the different challenges that you can expect to face across that curve. I thought I'd introduce this one in here just to kind of give you an idea of some of the skills required as you sort of move along that space. You can kind of see some of the traditional stuff within the business transition and improvement space. And then as you're sort of getting up into the business on enterprise design and planning space, you're actually getting into other tools which traditional business architects may not have used before and they might be unfamiliar with. But in actual fact, you bring an architectural mind to this, and this is the formalization language of trying to take those wicked problems and those unresolved mysteries and solve them using some of these standard tech tools and techniques, which you still can use up within that sort of top right section. All right, so what could this actually look like? Well, let's kind of start at the bottom end of the mandate curve and slowly move our way up. I'm running for time there, halfway. So what normally happens is you have a strategic exercise that occurs. More often than not, the architecture discipline is not invited to that exercise, and sort of the executive team emerges with that, I think, okay, here's our strategy for the next 5 years, let's make it happen. And traditionally what happens is that's given to the PMO, the Project Management Office, and those bunch of initiatives are handed over to PMO and cascaded down to the business units. Each business unit goes away, brings on their particular cronies and teams that they've worked with, and loosely aligns to the strategy by ticking a box to say, yes, we're aligning to that goal or that objective. And that fragmentation has actually occurred way before it's even got to the architecture space. We find that fragmentation occurs up in the strategic landscape, even just with the language within the strategic landscape. Walk into a business meeting and ask them, well, what's the difference between a strategy and a goal? What's the difference between a goal and objective? And how do they enable each other? Which is the means, which is the end? And you'll soon realize that there's confusion around that language in that space, and fragmentation occurs there. And different consulting firms are going to come on board, and they're each going to come with their own definitions and their own frameworks, and resulting in these strategic themes and strategic initiatives. But the fragmentation is very begun to occur, and they kind of trickle down in different ways. And you and I probably all, we can have testimony of many projects we've been on in which we've come in later in the day, and we're trying to now map back up to that. I think the worst one I've been on was in a project where sort of 3 years in into the cycle, a major vendor was already coding the software for this major transformation. And we were called in to try and help the business understand why they were doing this, because the original strategic alignment had vanished, sitting in people's heads, and those people had left the business, and they had to give account for the millions of dollars spent and the reasonings and the driving and the value framework and the performance framework that had been designed to be able to measure the success of this project. Nothing like that existed. So, you've got to kind of go and almost work your way back up in that particular cycle. But what this particular scenario looks at is really, well, often project and portfolio management is sitting above the architecture discipline, and therefore creates a fragmented architectural effort, which occurs across programs or projects and portfolios, depending on how you view it. And that's probably where most of us are familiar with working. It's driven by that project management effort, and there's some interesting techniques that you can apply to move yourself out of that space. And really one of those is, even just to try and move further up that curve, is to move to the next scenario, which says, well, hold on, can we, instead of looking at initiatives, can we build a capability view of the organization and rather have strategic themes defined as capabilities and not initiatives yet, and then understand the broader business model of the organization and build a roadmap on the back of that, and then cascade that roadmap down into the project management office and down into the various business units. That really what that means is moving project management below the architecture discipline, because we often find that the project management, they bring a good cost, resource, and effort discipline to the space, but don't necessarily have a view into overlap of business capability. How ready is the business to be able to adapt to certain of the changes required? Where are the strategic pressures versus the tactical pressures of the business, and how can we focus our effort on the quick wins where there's an overlap? Often the project management world doesn't necessarily have that lens, so it's a very good team effort that you can go to, or the very first place you want to start. We spoke about designing, it's the interrelationships of the disciplines that are the most important, and one of the first areas you want to target is the interrelationship between you and the PMO's office, because if you can give them the answers to those types of questions and become more of a team as opposed to separate disciplines working and competing against one another, there's a huge value in that exercise, and definitely the first place that you need to start. And really sort of taking us up into this space, which kind of sort of moves business architecture even further up the stack into the business planning space. It gets you to use some of the traditional tools like driver tree hierarchies, enterprise value frameworks, and performance models and maps, and actually using in your business architecture discipline is used to design those things, and help the business identify what types of business models will work well for them to address their strategic motivations. And then playing out those business models. In other words, well, we've got a semi-integrated universal bank, product specialist, customer owner, infrastructure provider. Well, these are the different business models that we can use to be able to achieve those goals in the organization. Well, what could they look like? Well, the business architecture function, before it even gets to delivering project management, let's take this forward, let's play out these scenarios and figure out which of these is going to be the best move forward. Right, so that's really the space where I see the most value being added, because now you've already designed the business even before you've actually made the decision of which business model to pursue. I'm just going to do a quick sanity check to make sure. Seem to having some audio problems there. Hopefully you guys can hear me. All right, so what that does then is take us to positioning this business architecture discipline on this enterprise head of the business planning space. And that's some of the aspects that we deal with within our training. So sort of midway here, just give you a little pitch on the Applied Business Architecture course, which is going to be running in Toronto, New York, which we look at that journey of understanding the motivation by documenting the motivation while taking you through an entire journey of designing different strategic business scenarios and what each of those business models might look like. And we take you through, by the courses that we're going to be running, which is in Toronto and New York City. You can get the dates from the Enterprise Architects website. And really what we do is we take you through this process of teaching you how to harvest the goals and objectives, not necessarily define them, but harvest them, document them into motivation models, look at business model strategies, define a value chain, defining our capabilities, cross-functional capabilities, and producing a whole bunch of overlays that run on top of that. And that's a sort of 4-day accelerated view of applying business architecture that we're offering to market through IAG into your market space. And with those types of tools, these are the types of questions you can begin to answer. So if I were to just take a capability model that is aligned to strategy, run a few exercises over the capability model, these are the types of questions that I can answer. I can tell the stakeholders, well, this is what you think is important to your business. We can identify strengths and weaknesses that run across the business by looking at maturity. We can look at where CapEx is currently flowing within my organization, and OPEX by looking at some of the in-flight projects and investment overlays. Okay? I can also look at where some of my tactical and political pressures are by looking at hotspots and pain points. And that's just by producing some overlays on top of a capability model. And if I mix those overlays even further, I can start to answer some more detailed questions. Am I able to achieve my strategy? Is lack of maturity causing tactical issues? Am I over or underspending? Is my current investment portfolio dealing with technical issues? So you can see you can actually start to mix and match your findings by just focusing, building a cohesive business model of the organization and doing a variety of overlays that could sit on it. And the PMO, by the way, loves this stuff. And it brings a lot of value to giving them the lens into the delivery space that they didn't have originally. All right, so the challenge is, well, okay, Craig, this is all nice. We'd all love to operate up at that level, but how can we actually do it? How can we improve our current efforts? I want to move quite fast through the section. So, first point here is, look, business architecture is not the capstone of the enterprise architecture discipline. It's not driven by an architectural focus and eventually, well, let's make ourselves more relevant to business and therefore let's add business architecture on top of that. It should be driven by business, and the executive council has done some interesting research on which of those models work successfully, but the general findings is that business architecture led by business has greater results for business, and there's more value added because it's driven by business. It's not rocket science, I think we all know it, but strangely enough, business architecture traditionally is more driven by the CIO's office and some of the technical domains. All right, so, no rocket science here, build your business opportunistically. Well, where could that be? Well, some of the ways that techniques we teach you, we often think, well, the customer experience is a fantastic place for you to start, especially if you're trying to incorporate some of those enterprise design thinking disciplines. Well, how can we actually look at the experience that the customer's having with our organization and look at ways that we can improve that, and then have that be the glue or the cross-functional capability that can guide our efforts. In other words, all right, we've got all this Lego blocks sitting within our organization. They're all capabilities. How can I string those capabilities together in different ways to improve the experience that my customers have with my organization? That's a very, very good place to start. So when we're talking about building a business architecture practice opportunistically, I always like to focus in that space. So where do we start? We can't boil the ocean approach here. See if you can tackle one of those journeys, because often they'll run across the entire value chain of the organization. And you can start to prove value not only to your internal organization, but also directly to your customer. All right, so anchor your business in capabilities. And we refer to this as a business anchor model. We use capabilities to reflect it. And really, that's kind of like that bottom section there, which is the operating model. And really, it's an anchor model because it brings a consistent business language to the organization and defined as a set of capabilities. These are your abilities to do something within the organization. And this is your box of Lego blocks that you have the ability to manipulate and work with so that you can actually achieve different outcomes. Well, what is that box of Lego blocks? Well, in actual fact, a lot of organizations don't have those. They might have bits and pieces of it. They might have a process model. They might have an application architecture. The capability landscapes as well. When I talk about capability, it's the resources. How do I mix them? The people, process, and tools to drive out a particular outcome. So how do I mix those people, process, and tools to drive that outcome is when I'm in the capability landscape space. And building an anchor model is like building a map of a city. It's there, and you can now overlay grid structure, electricity grid that goes over it, and you can overlay a crime hotspots grid that goes over it. So it's a map of the city. There are lots of overlays there, which is what we refer to as capability-based approach. Most of you are familiar with that. What you're probably not familiar with is we find is that this capability anchor model is often driven by a CIO, and he wants to bring more credibility to his organization. So he wants to develop a business language, and he's trying to use capabilities to do that. It's a good start, but your business people get over their excitement of this model very, very quickly. All right, so it's okay, you show me what I do, but it's not helping you address some of my key challenges. And that's kind of like where some of your sort of cross-functional disciplines can come in. Right? So this is really where we can take the standard functional capabilities and we can string them together in a variety of different ways to achieve different outcomes. And if you overlay maturities across that, you can answer some interesting questions like, well, maybe mature enough to achieve these outcomes, but it's not actually mature enough to achieve outcomes in another part of the business. And so it creates more of an outcome-focused organization or outcome-focused architecture. Right, so no rocket science here. So invest in creating ownership of your actual outcomes. Surprisingly enough, it's often seen as business architects go away and do it and come back with that ta-da moment. I think with Agile becoming more and more of a common language, I think that's changing a lot, where we're beginning to produce architectures in an extremely draft format with a number of unanswered questions early on to our stakeholders and customers, so that they're part of the process and they're involved in the process of actually architecting. And then you're actually even teaching them how to apply business architecture to their discipline as well. So you're equipping them. So it gives them a good sense of ownership. And even when you're creating architectural sponsors, and this is some interesting research which came out of Infotech around, well, you can actually, in bringing on different sponsors, even an external sponsor or a consultant, you're actually increasing the visibility or the improvement of the outcome of an architectural exercise by involving those types of consultants earlier on in the sponsorship phase, the pitch for the consulting space. But these are the types of external sponsors and highly placed executives that you've actually got to look for, so that you can actually get the traction of the organization. Next one is focus on resources. So often we see capability models, it's a name in a box, right? Whereas in actual fact, what we see is that use the language of people, process, and tools as you have conversations with your business stakeholders. It's not about a name in a box, all right, whether it's sales execution capability, all right. It's actually about the mix of resources that sit within that capability. It's about the people, process, and tools. And if you actually talk in the people, process, and tools space, it actually brings a lot of value to those conversations with your stakeholder. It actually makes it more real for them than just a box with a name in it. So careful of those models where it's just those. I mean, obviously they're just visual representations, but you want to be able to have a conversation at this level where you're actually breaking it down into underlying resources. And the example I'm showing you there is how we actually align that to the business objectives, with which aspects of those underlying resources are going to affect what parts of your goals and your strategic objectives. All right, yeah, no rocket science here. Once again, we often get bogged down with the architecture within business architecture. And if I could ask you to show virtual hands, you'll probably be right. If I ask you the question, so I'm just picking up some feedback on the voice. I'll sit a little closer. So we often spend a lot of time talking about the architectural discipline, and we have arguments about meta models, and we have arguments about views and viewpoints and frameworks and methods. Now those things are all good, and those are the utility of your architectural space. But really, for the business people, that's not really where the values lie. It is at the end about the business. I mean, one simple technique that we actually found worked quite well was when we leveraged the motivation model a whole lot more. So we took the goals and objectives and we slotted them into the means to an end chain of the business motivation model, which is something that we teach you in the course. And for an architect, it's like, well, that's not rocket science. That's pretty easy. You just build a model from it. But in actual fact, for business sponsors, they find it incredibly helpful to walk around with this motivation model underneath their arm, a nice big A3 colorful sheet, because it explained to them what it was that they were trying to achieve. And we actually then began to use that as an anchor model, and we overlaid a variety of different types of findings on top of this particular model. So when I refer to the business motivation model, you can see it there. It's mission, vision, strategies, goals, tactics, and objectives, just those pieces. And then the diagram beneath is just a visual representation of that. But it's a valuable tool, to talk business language, not talk architecture. Because even capabilities, we find, is quite an architectural term. Okay. All right, and business architecture, okay, it's not about where. Often I get asked, well, what's the best organizational model for architecture? Where should I place it? Where should I build my center of excellence? And yes, those things are good questions to ask. And in any functional-based organization, you're going to want to be able to position it. But it's really about who you're actually putting in that place, not necessarily the actual organizational structure to put it. And leveraging some thinking from the lean world, I really think that, business architecture, some people are sort of saying, well, let's introduce it as a permanent function into business and the rest of it. And I think that that's good, but I do believe it has to be project-based. And I think that the way that we've got to do that is, instead of getting a focus on titles, right, and leveraging some thinking from, I think of Roger Martin here, in actual fact, incentivize business architects to solve wicked problems, and that their CV is the wicked problems that they've solved. And so their resume is actually less about projects and titles that have actually been worked on, but the types of problems that I've actually dealt with, the types of unsolved mysteries that I've been involved with in dealing and solving. And that's the space of the architect. That's actually what they're good at. They're good at trying to shift that mystery space through the knowledge funnel as quickly as possible. If we're using a Scrum technique or any other technique, they're trying to move it through the knowledge funnel, all right, to come up with ways to solve it. So, and that can really only occur at a project level. And yet in organizations, you want to be able to try and leverage a structure that would cater for that. So really just try and look at, well, the most effective type of organizational model for your business architecture function within your specific organizations. And we go through a few of those models in the training as well. All right, classic problem, we get stuck in the current state. So there's a lot more value in understanding the future state. And the reason here is I actually find that business people often don't understand the future state. They need the business architect's skill set to help take them on that journey. And they don't necessarily know. They know the business levers to pull, but they're not quite sure how it looks, and how easy is it to achieve all of those aspects. And I think if we focus on that, design that future state, that gives us an excellent way to ring fence our current state analysis. Whereas often we get into the current state world and boil the ocean, and we get stuck in the quagmire of understanding current processes and mapping it to applications and people, and we're producing value that is old. It's been done. We want to produce value for the future, so be careful not to get stuck in that as-is space. And we often find that the motivation model, when you have it expanded, it's quite good to keep us focused on that. This is what you've got to achieve. You've got to help the business achieve these motivations. So these are the pieces of, that you want to focus on as a business architect, not necessarily the current state. All right, and then time check on this. Good. All right. Then there's the sort of aspect of business architecture I believe provides a lot of value, which is helping the business understand their strategic scenarios. And this is all about providing insight into those strategic scenarios. In other words, okay, those business models that I identified up in the beginning, but what could they look like once I've been through the business architecture exercise? Well, for scenario one, there's incremental and significant change that's occurring across these capabilities, and there's smaller changes across the other ones, so you can get to a point where you look at time frame, net benefit. Now the business people are able to make a decision based upon sort of those tangible pieces. And in other words, we've actually played out the strategic scenario. And we know what it looks like at a high level because we've architected aspects of it. We can now see which of these we can achieve in a short amount of time and the least amount of cost. Next one is, and these are fairly simple, so I'm going to move quite fast to them. Align to your planning cycle within an organization. Often we go in and we do business architecture. Yes, we do it within a project space, but often it's not aligned to the general planning cycle, especially at the enterprise level. So I understand what the planning cycle is across the different governance boards, across the actual board of the organization, to the executive boards, to the permit to work boards and the control boards and all of those types of things, and understand all of those pieces and where business architecture can plug in and provide value across those cycles. And especially what we find is that how you can actually plug in across the economic cycle. Well, this is some fascinating research, and I don't want to spend too long here because we're limited for time, but it's actually done by the leading practice guys. And what it does is it looks at the various, so let's call them GFCs or market changes that have occurred, and how business, and especially our discipline business architecture, has adapted to try and deal with these changes. And what you're seeing is that as you move through the cycle, you're seeing more and more changes occur that will sound familiar to you. So you're actually getting to the point where, if we look here, 1980, you've got this sort of maroon bubble, you've got a light blue and dark bubble. And what that's saying is that, well, in 1980, in order to deal with the depression or the recession that was coming, people began to reboot their cost models. Right? And then they began to reboot their service model, that you're providing additional services. And then ultimately began to look at rebooting their revenue models. And then as we've progressed further to the right, you'll start to see there's things like performance models and value models. That activity is starting to occur before a recession has occurred, as well as during and after a recession. And these are the types of formalization tools which we as business architects are used to and work with on a constant basis. But you can kind of see, based upon this interesting research, where those tools are used at different parts of the economic life cycle. Kind of taking a step back at the broader business and having a look at how it can deal with some of those disruptive aspects. All right. Next point is, and I'll probably finish on this one just for time's sake. What we've found quite successful within organizations is to help them build what's referred to as a cross-disciplinary team. So if you look at your capability, you have people, process, and tools to drive out an outcome. And you drive that out through your project structure, in other words, your project and delivery structure. And you need money to do it. So if you get all of those individuals into a team structure or a project structure, you've actually got a very, very good mix to drive out some of these changes within an organization. Because in actual fact, each of those disciplines is trying to do the same thing. They're trying to get an enterprise view. They're trying to get an enterprise view to help with transformation. So PMO is looking at all of the projects that run across it. Technology is looking at all of the technology that supports horizontally across the business. Change management is looking at all of the people that are being impacted by the changes. Finance is looking at financing the whole piece. And your business improvement and process teams similarly are looking at the enterprise level. And often we find that these individuals are working in their own disciplines and in their separate silos. And we've seen it very successfully implemented by recommending teams that bring these pieces together and allow them to focus on those wicked problems that I keep talking about. Allow them to focus on those challenges and become teams that deliver against those unsolved mysteries. And later on, sometimes we've introduced it as, okay, it's a temporary project, this team's getting together to solve a particular problem. And later on, we've actually have made it a full-time sort of function within the organization, which gives it sometimes a little more credibility depending on how political the organization is. All right. So now there's a few other slides in here which I haven't got to. Actually, let me just finish up on this because I think I'm going to do a little introduction a little bit. I just want to touch on this one. I think sometimes we get bogged down with this very big business process or this business architecture framework or technique and method. And really, this is where some of the design thinking aspects come in, which is, architect, take some pages out of that discipline, architect on the serviette and interact with your stakeholders at that level with whatever you've designed on the serviette. and you're iterating through that cycle, and you're keeping those stakeholders and sponsors involved right up at the raw edge of it. And it does require a change in mindset, not from your side, because you might be familiar with that, but actually from your stakeholder side. The change in mindset to realize that you're going to be putting stuff on the table that's incomplete, rough, unresolved mysteries are still in there, but keeping them involved early on in that cycle. And I've seen that work really, really, really well. And in big organizations and small organizations, as you begin to involve your stakeholders earlier on in that cycle. So, the usual thing, think big, start small, scale fast aspects. And then sort of ending off just on these two slides here, which is all about just reinforcing that shift that's occurring in the market. Traditionally, we had a product life cycle, and we had to release new products to the market quicker, better, faster, and be able to move them through the cycle more effectively. That's occurring so fast now that people are beginning to launch new business models. And Alex Osterwalder says that business models like a can of yogurt. It eventually goes stale, it goes off, so you've got to reboot it. And this is the business model innovation space. And this is the dilemma of I spoke about in the beginning of those different quadrants, where you've got to innovate more in the top right quadrant, but a lot of it's becoming utility. And this is where we're having to help business now. How can we do business model innovation? That goes right up into the brand and enterprise platform as well. There's different aspects of what you're rebooting of your organization, and they're starting to occur faster and faster from sort of bottom upwards. Sort of leading to this concept of enterprise design. In other words, well, how can I bring the architecture discipline to the design discipline? In other words, the design thinking aspects. Kind of merge these two pieces together so that it becomes more about the experience that we have, more about introducing some of those agile techniques, introducing some of the design aspects, and the fail fast and all of those aspects that we see working quite well. And a lot of people have said, well, that's not really traditional business architecture. Well, that's why we've coined this term enterprise design. But that's still work in progress, and we might just land up at a strategic business architecture function. But it's really looking at some of those aspects of the organization and how we can look at the organization holistically to try and build more coherency into that environment. Now, there's some advanced stuff on the back of this. I'm going to actually upload it into the SlideShare and interact with me via email and my contact details. I have looked at applying different patterns to business architecture. I've looked at cooperation and cooperative ways that we can work and the rest of it. But happy to take some of those questions offline. Just for time's sake, that's where I'll finish, and I'll switch over to Judith to see if there are any questions.
Okay, so thanks very much, Craig. One participant's asked me a couple of questions, actually, and one of them is, strategic planning cycle has already begun to fund projects for 2015. And so in order to follow your recommendations, how would you see us being able to change the strategic fracture you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so one of the ways that we've actually done that, which has worked quite well, so let's talk about the stakeholders' concerns at the time. They were looking at, and the work had actually begun. So they'd begun this big transformation exercise. There was 180 programs that were going on. And the general view from the executive was, wow, there's a lot of stuff going on out there. Are we doing the right thing? Are we investing in the right place? Is there not overlap occurring across these 180 programs? And that's where we actually leveraged the PMO angle quite well, in which we went into the exercise. Yes, the strategic plan was in place, the transformation exercise was already underway, and we mapped all of the effort that was occurring across all of these programs, across the current investment slate and investment cycle. And we were able to show significant fragmentation by giving them a business lens into their project portfolio, into their CapEx investment. We were able to show where CapEx investment wasn't producing OpEx spend. We were able to show a lack of coherency across projects. And there was one particular project or capability. There were 77 programs trying to do the same thing on one capability. Right? And you can understand, wow, that's an amount of meetings, emails going backwards and forwards. So we gave them this lens into that landscape. And what that resulted in was them altering their transformation cycle, basically. So yes, the strategic plan had already been put in place, but what the business architecture ends up giving them is a way to realign that plan to be more effective across the organization. In other words, to allow them to achieve their strategy sooner and with less fragmentation.
Okay, thank you. There's actually there's quite a few, and so we won't get to them all. I was just going to ask one more real quick because it's 5:35 now. What would you say is the difference between enterprise architecture and business architecture?
Oh, no, the definition space. So and it's actually a really good question because it's one of those, which we have lots of discussions about collective group known for an architects, an argument of architects. So we do have lots of discussions about these. So I would think that the enterprise architecture discipline is actually the glue that links all of the domains together. And the business architecture is one of those domains. So an enterprise architect really has to have a view of the strategic performance, organizational, information integration, technology, data application technology pieces. So you can see there's quite a few disciplines that enterprise architect must understand how to glue together, but won't necessarily have an understanding of all the detailed tool sets and techniques that each of those disciplines require. So does that mean that the EA knows everything about service design? No, it doesn't. He's going to use somebody with specific skills in that space. Does it mean that the enterprise architect knows all of the tools and techniques of business analysis and business architecture from Babok and Bismarck and those things? No, it doesn't. He's going to leverage those skills to do it. So, sometimes EAs are even referred to as program architects because they have that broader oversight right across the whole spectrum. Whereas the business architect brings a very, very strong understanding both of structure of how to design business as well as actual business content. In other words, sometimes the deep understanding of that business, whether it could be a financial business or whether a manufacturing business, those aspects. Bringing those two pieces together creates a powerful sort of offering to the business.
Thank you for your time today and for your attending. I hope you enjoyed the session, just so that everybody can see how to get a hold of us. So as Craig has mentioned, some of you may be interested in the public training courses. It is probably one of the best training courses on business architecture, applied business architecture, quite frankly, I have ever seen, and it's written by Craig. And we are authorized to deliver it here in North America. So if you're interested, please go take a look. There's some material up there and some quotes from participants from previous sessions. And feel free to reach out to Craig or I. The information is on your screen. We would love to hear from you.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Judith.
You're welcome.